I want to thank Senator Paul for organizing this hearing, and I want to thank the three of you in particular for your willingness to come and offer your expertise and the insights that you've offered today, which are really helpful. We're now in our 17th year of deployment under the 2001 authorization for the use of military force. It is not yet the case that our most junior personnel deployed were not born as of the moment that 2001 AUMF was issued by Congress, but it will soon be the case. Long before it's even fathomable that we will have retreated from these battlefields, it will be the case that this AUMF was issued before they were born. In the meantime, we've got some issues to deal with. You know, we've spent $2.8 trillion in these efforts under the 01 and 02 AUMFs. And there's not a lot of accountability that comes when Congress continues to look the other way or tolerate ongoing efforts, ongoing deployments consistent with those 01 or 02 AUMFs without having additional discussions on what exactly we're doing, on why U.S. blood and treasure should be put on the line. And so instead of the people's elected representatives debating, discussing these things in real time, these issues have been left to the will and the whim of a small handful of political elites in Washington, D.C. This is scary, and it's contrary to the text and the structure and the history and the tradition underlying our Constitution. So it's one of the reasons why I welcome this hearing and why I think we need to have this discussion. So I've got a few questions. We'll start with you, Mr. Anders. Earlier this year, as you're probably aware, members of Congress received a letter from the Department of Defense relying on a 1975 argument suggesting that the only time Congress has a role, an indispensable role in authorizing U.S. forces to be deployed is when deployed units of U.S. forces are on the ground engaged in a kinetic exchange. Do you agree with that, and if not, why?
No, we don't agree with that. And that's, first of all, it's the role of Congress to provide, and it's their exclusive authority to provide authorization in advance before a military engagement in the absence of a need to repel a sudden attack. And that's the constitutional standard.
And it's often not how we fight wars today anyway. I mean, there are there's lots of kinds of warfare that we engage in today that doesn't necessarily involve a kinetic exchange between people on the ground.
That's right, and I think this this again is something that began during the Obama administration. This definition of what hostilities mean under the War Powers Resolution, and what the position that the President Obama eventually took was that hostilities did not include air power in the absence of ground troops. And that, of course, means that lots of places, as you just referenced, where the United States is at war, are not considered hostilities. And so, therefore, the War Powers Resolution, which does include deadlines for withdrawing in the absence of congressional authorization, don't apply. So with that opinion from Harold Koh, then the legal advisor at the State Department to President Obama, the executive branch pretty much wrote out of existence a good part of the War Powers Resolution.
Which is of concern to many of us here and ought to be more so than it is within Congress. Professor Turley, as you know, it was well understood at the time of the founding and was made an understanding based on how the Constitution was written that the president, unlike the king, would not have unilateral power to go to war. In fact, Hamilton makes this point in Federalist number 69. So when people talk about the immense power vested in the executive to deploy military personnel, from what source are they claiming that authority exists?
There is no source. The interesting thing about this particular provision in Article 1, Section 8 is it was viewed at the time as the defining work of the convention. That is, you had framers who joined together who were normally not in agreement and said, this is how we can address this. They all agreed that they didn't want a situation like the one we have today, where a president has this type of unilateral authority, and they believed they had fixed the problem because Article 1, Section 8 could not be more clear. And to fold this back to the question that you asked my colleague, the definition that the president put forward of this kinetic conflict was used in the litigation that I led on behalf of Democratic and Republican members. So the Obama administration came forward when we were challenging the Libyan war as an undeclared war and came into court and said, you know what, it's not a war by our definition. And when we had that argument, they went further than that. And they said, the president alone defines what war is. Now, we presented that to the court and says, does that track with you? Do you honestly think that the framers put this specific of an obligation, spent this amount of time, and it all comes down to a noun that the president is simply allowed to define? By the end of the litigation, by the way, I had no better idea of what kinetic means in wartime than I did before, but what I did understand—
It means you're hitting stuff, I think.
Yeah, I guess so. But it got to that point of absurdity. And this is all an effort to avoid clarity. You know, you try to change the noun if you can't deal with the obligation.
To avoid clarity, I think that's a good description. To avoid clarity in a place where morality, decency, and justice would seem to demand clarity and where the Constitution provides clarity. Judge Napolitano, I want to talk to you for a moment about the associated forces doctrine. Executives from both political parties for decades now have used this as justification for a number of military operations. But when I read the text of the 2001 authorization for the use of military force, it seems somewhat clear to me that it covers a fairly narrow scope of targets to include, quote, those nations, organizations, or persons that he being the president, determines planned, authorized, committed, or aided the terrorist attacks that occurred on September 11, 2001, or harbored such organizations or persons, close quote. Can you explain to me the limits of this AUMF, meaning what groups or geographic regions the U.S. could legitimately go into under this authority?
Well, Senator Lee, I have argued that the AUMFs, both of them, 2001 and 2002, are unconstitutional because they failed to include an endpoint. And that's the reason we're having this hearing today, because presidents have used these to go wherever they wanted to go. I mean, George Orwell predicted all of this when he said words would determine liberty. If the president can define war rather than the Congress defining war, he or she will define it in a way to facilitate his or her use of it. I mean, at one point, the Obama administration argued that the use of intelligence forces on the ground who weren't wearing uniforms with insignias on them is not the same as military forces on the ground. Well, they looked a little different because they didn't shave every day, but they were carrying the same type of offensive weaponry with which to kill people that hadn't been authorized by the Congress. So the use of the phrase associated forces and permitting the commander-in-chief to define what those mean, I used this phrase earlier with Senator Merkley, is like Justice Jackson said, dissenting in Korematsu, a loaded gun in a desk drawer of the president, ready for him to take it out and shoot it whenever he wants.
Well said. I see my time's expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.